I think all of us, if you are a human, especially if you are in the creative field, you know intimately what failure looks like. So we essentially just grabbed some people that we thought would be really compelling and decided to, again, not single somebody out, but have sort of an interesting discussion around it. So we did that at Doobie's a couple weeks ago. We had a really engaging, dynamic discussion. I want to have all of the panelists stand up really quickly, and I'll introduce you. So Chris Attenborough of Attenborough-Naftel, he's going to speak more. Camille Bethune-Brown, who's a yoga instructor and blogger in Baltimore. Gavin Witt, who's a dramaturg for Center Stage. Jamie Campbell, who's of Shine Creative. This is getting weak ass, come on. And then we have Aaron Fitzpatrick, otherwise known as Aaron Fitzbaum, who's a visual artist. Thanks, guys. Okay.
Failure is synonymous with negativity, with, oh, you weren't good enough or you didn't put your entire effort, so therefore you failed, try again harder next time. We have to redefine what it means to be a failure. Does it always have to have the negative connotation?
So if everybody wants to go around and tell a story or an example of failure from your personal or professional life. We'll start with you, Jamie.
Start with me, okay. When anyone talks about the word failure, I automatically resonate with that word completely because I was almost 40 and I was decided I was gonna do what I dreamt to do, and that's open up a shop or be a shop owner. I had a come to Jesus moment and realized that this was not supporting me, and so I had to close the shop. Melissa and I had to close the shop.
This time last year, if you had talked to me, I was just a depressive slump. In addition to losing my job, because you have to make an income, I lost my apartment. And it was in that experience of hitting rock bottom that I had to let myself cry, let myself be vulnerable and say, Camille, you don't have all the answers. You don't know what the step is. And sometimes there's fear in not having the next step. I mean, for goodness sake, I have my life planned out up through November on Google Calendar.
I don't feel like I've had a major failure yet. I feel like I've had a lot of tiny failures in my hustle along the way to become what I'm trying to be, and that's a self-employed visual artist. And in November, it'll be a year since I quit my last shift and went off on my own, and it's been a really long time.
A number of years ago, we spent 2 to 3 years developing a piece, working with an Israeli playwright on an extremely provocative, challenging, very political piece that had been a part of his life for probably a decade at that point. And we got to the end of rehearsals. We were going to open on Wednesday, and Sunday night I got a call from him. He said, Gavin, you must come see me immediately. I am a failure. This is terrible. Come talk to me. I'm so upset. And looks at me and says, the ending is completely wrong. I have finally realized, this is not the right ending for the play. And I remember that feeling of just, sort of abject disappointment.
There are multitudes of people that came before you that feel exactly what you are feeling, and there are multitudes of people after you that will be feeling exactly what you are feeling, that has the potential to become something dynamic or something to work with, as opposed to just being in this state of isolation.
I guess I've worked with another artist named Sean Naftel. We started Attenborough-Naftel about 5 years ago, and ever since our first piece, we've consistently had failure. But the failures that happen within the piece sometimes become the most interesting aspect of them. So not being scared of that failure that's going to inevitably happen and kind of embracing it, and then when the failure does happen, taking that and using it as a aesthetic piece.
The creative discovery is that it's okay to take the risk and have it not be what you expect it to do, but the payoff is in what you learn from that and where you go next.
It allows you to kind of connect and dig into your most authentic self and really reevaluate some things.
If it doesn't work out, then you're just like, all right, well, that didn't work out. You just keep going, you keep going, you just going, you know? And so the more risks you take, the easier the next risk is, you know?
Failure is so deeply ingrained in who we are, and and yet people endure day after day after day after day, and there's a kind of toughness in that.
Well, thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Cheers. Cheers. Cheers.
So, with no further ado, Chris on failure.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. This is the big important part of art and creative practice is people showing up. Otherwise, it's just you sitting with your work in the studio, and that's just no fun, really. So this is Sean and I working together. This is when we were working on the Winnebago project that had many reiterations, some through failure and also just people not buying the piece and us being stuck with this large Winnebago for a long period of time. I guess the first thing to think about is when we're approaching failure creatively is that fearing failure, you can't set out to do failure. If you do that, it's basically sabotage or it's planned obsolescence. So largely that within the creative field is something that inhibits us from doing work just in general. Is we're expected to come up with a plan, we're expected to have the complete idea laid out, and whether that's for funding or a final project when you're in school, that sort of happens. So I constantly tell my students this because at midterms we have them write a proposal of what their assignment's going to be, but you really want them to follow their intuitive process throughout the rest of the semester. Otherwise, if you sit down and you're like, I'm going to have 6 prints on the wall, they're going to look exactly like this, where is your investigation within the studio practice? So this idea kind of came from when I first got to Ireland. Most of my work I felt like looked like Dorothea Lange's photos, which wasn't my work really at all. You get there and it's very scenic and it's beautiful and there's all these kind of picturesque landscapes, and that just wasn't interesting me. So I had to kind of work with the materials that I had at hand. And one of those was the internet and the television, which was at my house. And people kind of kept coming up to me and they would say, you know, where are you from? And I'd say, I'm from Baltimore. And they'd say, oh, The Wire. And I'm like, well, yeah, we've all had that experience, I think, if you've lived here. So I started thinking about that in the landscape of The Wire and attempting to explain a landscape through that, and digitally started doing screen captures and then removing the characters from it, so they were just these abstract landscapes. Initially, when I started out with that, I wasn't sure that that's where the project was going to go, but I just had to keep kind of watching it and thinking about it and thinking about that experience. And then there's many layers that come to that. Then again, it went into the television. I photographed it on the television, so the pixelation came up. That was an old tube television as well. So if I had set out and said, this is exactly what I'm going to do, I wouldn't have had that understanding and new knowledge of the materials. And then my friend Sean came to Ireland, and Sean's studio was very opposite from mine. You know, with that project, I was sitting there kind of working at the computer, and there was this guy that had a really messy studio on the other side of the building. And we started kind of talking about the same things and how that would work. And this came down to materials again, is that everybody that was kind of at the college was constantly frustrated with having the materials to produce a piece. So often you would project a piece and say, this is what I'm going to do. And then you get there and you're like, I can't do this for whatever reason because I didn't have this. And this constantly happens with students as well. You'll show up for a critique and it's like, I didn't do this because I didn't have matte paper. I didn't do this because I had glossy paper. And it's like, well, sometimes you just have to make it happen. So this piece was really making it happen from that. We only used a 10-mile radius around the piece to create the piece. And I think this kind of set the benchmark for Sean and my work. There was a piece before this, which was a complete failure, but I'll get to that later of why that's not in this slideshow. So as we're working through this, we had this piece had come from a joke. And again, there was following our intuition and going with it. And one of the nice things about art school is that you constantly have deadlines that you have to complete work. And sometimes those deadlines are good, and they push you through those failures because you're like, well, I have to get this done or I'm not going to have anything on the wall. And then when you get into studio practice, I think outside of school, there's no one there sometimes being like, where's your work? You're like, I'll take another month. I'll take another 2 months on this. And sometimes you just talk about work more than doing work. So you just have to kind of take what you have and start producing. And then while you're working, there's this understanding of different materials. And I think the thing is that we don't always engage with materials because we're scared of them. This is a throw blanket that Sean and I made for a piece. And both of us were pretty terrible at sewing. But I think in that, that's what makes the piece unique. Only the artist can create the drips of paint or a thumbprint that goes into the paint. And those are the things that really make that unique. Tom Sachs, who is a huge kind of influence on Sean and my work, and we see a lot of parallels between him, it says that it's the advantage of the artist to show these things because it's something that only he can do. And that's something that we forget as well. I remember attempting to do hard edge painting when I was in art school, and I was really terrible at that. But now that I think about it, I should have just gone with what had happened, and then that would have become my aesthetic. This whole experience was really amazing. We were both kind of in coveralls trying to find a sewing machine and went into this wool shop. And I think the ladies thought that we were going to rob them or something. Wool shops don't sell sewing machines, by the way, if you're ever curious. So then there sometimes is a piece that is a failure. Plywood for us was really a very exciting time. We had been doing roving project for a number of years and had come across this vacant space in Belvedere Square. We did have some great shows, I feel like. All the artists that showed work were really great. But at the same time, through the failure of that for Sean and I mean, we almost completely stopped working together during this because it was away from what we were doing. It was away from our intention. And it had gotten to the point where we were running a gallery and neither of us really wanted to be gallerists. It was more about people engaging the space. But property management gets involved and they want you to be open 9 to 5 every day. And that just really wasn't what we were interested in. But through that experience of plywood, we realized what we wanted to do and what we didn't want to do. And I think that's a really important part of working is that you get to those points where you're like, this is terrible. I hate art. I'm done. Like, I'm going to give up. I'm just going to do this now. And I think we kind of got to that moment at one point, and when property management was like, the space got leased, we were like, awesome, we're out. And we took the sign, and we still have the sign in the garage, and that's the only remnant of that. So then the custom camper kind of came after that, and Sean and I had this camper left over from a number of artscapes, and we were revisiting what to do with this. It was sitting at my parents' house in Pennsylvania. They weren't too happy about this terrible-looking camper sitting there. I'm sure the neighbors weren't too happy with what it was doing to their property value. And we were kind of like, well, what do we do with this? We had originally done it as it was like a studio that was inside, and for insurance reasons, that was no longer possible. And so we gutted it, and the whole thing raised like 8 inches off the ground. And then we didn't really know what to do for a little while. But we sat there and we thought about it, and during that time, I was going to football games, and Sean and I would watch football games like at the house in kind of like a man cave scenario. And we were just talking about those two experiences, so we just pushed the two together. And during that time, we tailgated really strange events like birthday parties and things like that. So, so after a while, that sat there. We were done with that. We were like, we have to get rid of this thing. There's more work to be created, and no one would buy it. There was a urinal right in the middle of it. And people just weren't too happy about that. It was like right next to the bench where you'd sit down. So we gutted it again. And we started thinking about this whole project, like what if Sean and I were General Motors and we were making all these different sort of automobiles. So we started a catalog, and the second piece of it was the actual custom camper. And then no one would buy that again. And so we're like, well, what do we do with this now? And we had thought about the interaction of a raffle. So we threw a raffle at Union Brewing, and that's where we were. So I think working along those lines and being open to say, okay, this doesn't work, this failed, now time to do this. It's something that you have to get over. And if we hadn't failed with plywood, we wouldn't have gotten back to doing the work that we were interested in doing. And there was that point of plywood where I was like, I don't want to wake up, I don't want to do this, you know. And sometimes a piece just needs to kind of go into the dumpster. And that's the key, is being able to let that go. And working forward now, it's just, I mean, there's still certain things that we're figuring out, and I hope that never ends. If that ends and I have all the questions, or if you have all the questions and there aren't failures in it, you're just not going to create work anymore. I think there's always that question that's important. Once you do get that equation down, I've had friends that have done that, I feel like their work just stops. It could be materials, it could be concept, it could be anything. I have some friends that are very specific about every little single thing, but then there's no exploration within the studio. So after all of that, you know, we've been moving forward. We just had yard sale, which we were really happy with. This was kind of like right where we wanted it. It was in a gallery setting, which was nice. I always hated the idea of a gallery, but to be honest, they do all the things that Sean and I are terrible at, like measuring things, cataloging things, selling things. We were really terrible, as you know, with the camper, with selling things. And it was just nice to be able to have the work up and us being able to step back. And one of those failures is that we're not interested in being performance artists. We're interested in creating a space or an object that you interact with, but it's kind of free for you to experience. We want that to be something that's apparent. And again, that came out of the failure of plywood, where we had to constantly kind of be there. There were some other projects along the way where we were constantly in there and operating it, and that kind of wasn't our interest. There's no sort of exploration there. So just keep working. I think that's the key. And I think we've all created probably a painting that looks like mud or a sculpture that breaks. I was thinking about this when Katie asked for me to do this, and I was working in the studio one day, and I was thinking about being a marble sculptor, how you're working deductively at something. And if I was a marble sculptor and I hit the arm and it like knocked off the sculpture, I would probably like hot glue the thing and drywall screw it back into the piece. And then that's what makes the piece unique and my own. So, all right, thank you guys. Yeah.